Israel, the new Sparta, have effectively already defeated Iran militarily. Yeah. And Iran is in a very weak position. So that scenario is a possibility, but Iran will not have the international reach to destabilize the whole of the Middle East. It will be sort of a beleaguered country on the back foot and very much threatened by the military power of Israel, which has proved so effective in dismantling the axis of resistance.
The Foreign Secretary Yvette Cooper told us how the war against Iraq in 2003 had weighed on minds as the government decided to let America launch strikes against Iran. But if anything, this conflict is even more unpredictable than the war against Saddam Hussein. With no plans for ground forces to go into Iran, there's no guarantee the Iranian government will collapse. In fact, something potentially even more hostile could take its place. But on the upside, the West could finally remove, and indeed has removed, one of its most implacable enemies. Let's assess the risks and rewards of the war. In a moment, we'll get the views of Sir Richard Dearlove, the former head of MI6. But first, we're joined by Christina Lamb, the celebrated chief foreign correspondent of The Times. Christina, morning to you.
Good morning, Stig.
How do you judge what's happening in Iran now, if it's even possible to do that? The Ayatollah gone, many of his senior figures gone, but what fills the vacuum?
Yeah, I think we're in very dangerous times, as many people are saying, because I don't think very many people anyway, are shedding tears over the demise of the Ayatollah and also several other senior figures, military and intelligence, that have been killed. But what happens next? Is there a plan? Of course, as the Foreign Secretary referred to, many of us think about what happened in Iraq and other interventions. I covered the interventions in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Libya. And in all of those cases, the superior air power and military of the United States and the West quickly removed the regimes or dictators, but then it was chaos, and it's hard not to fear the same thing here, and in fact more so, because this is a huge country, 93 million people, very entrenched elite military force, the Revolutionary Guards, which are 150,000 aside from the regular army. And these people, people will replace the Ayatollah and other figures. So what happens next is really unclear, and we're not at all clear whether President Trump has a plan about this.
No, and do you buy the argument? We heard him on Air Force One saying, "Oh, I've done my bit, kind of, where I'm here to help you, but it's now for the people to rise up again." Bearing in mind that up to 30,000 or even more could have been killed by the regime in the last month or so. Is it plausible to think that the strikes will start the process and the Iranian people take it the rest of the way?
I think that's a difficult thing, because first of all, as you say, it's only late January, that this horrific slaughter happened of people that did come out on the streets. We know how brave the Iranian protesters have been, and they have repeatedly come out, as they did in 2002 in the Women Life Freedom protests. But this is a regime that is very practiced at cracking down on people, and this is existential. It will do whatever it takes to stay in power. And the problem with asking people to come out on the streets like this is they are unarmed, right? Whereas the people running the place are extremely well armed. So this is a very difficult thing to ask people
to do. It's a very good point that we just lost you there, I think, right at the end there. Christina, great to speak to you. Really interesting stuff. That's Christina Lamb, the chief foreign correspondent of The Times. Let's bring in Sir Richard Dearlove, the former head of MI6. Richard, morning to you.
Good morning, Stig.
The British position has shifted in over 24 hours. First, not supporting the US, now offering limited support when it comes to a defensive approach. Does that make sense to you, strategically and pragmatically?
Well, not really. I mean, I can't believe that the government didn't take a clearer position right from the start, and to change their mind within 24 hours and engage in this sophistry as to what the difference is between offense and defense. I just don't get it. I mean, they could have been more clear-cut right from the word go.
Would they have been told as well that by the US striking Iran, Iran was going to retaliate in a way that would potentially compromise British assets and interests that would require some form of defensive response. I mean, it strikes me that is that not an inevitable part of the conflict being escalated?
Well, personally, I would have thought so, because the Iranian options in responding to the US attack were very limited. So what are they going to do? They're going to do what they've always done, which is to destabilize regionally and go for soft targets, because their options are so limited. And of course, a lot of their capabilities has been destroyed. So they're going to go for the options available to them.
Are you surprised that that's involved relatively indiscriminate hits in places like Saudi Arabia? I know Saudi Arabia is a Sunni country, Iran's a Shia country, so there's no necessarily love lost there. But Iran does seem to have turned the region against itself rather than turning the region against America.
Well, I think you've got to go back to the basics, and this is the conflict between Sunni and Shia Islam.
Okay.
And Iran, in survival mode, is going to strike out at any Sunni target within range. I'm not surprised at all by what they've done. And I think, you've got to bear in mind the fundamentals that lie behind this conflict.
When it comes to the question of, when we talk about America's approach to this, does international law mean anything? Is it actually a meaningful concept for us to wrestle with? Or is it just whatever the strongest want to do, they end up doing?
Well, I'm very cynical personally about international law, but I'm not a lawyer. And,
Well, share your cynicism. You're the former head of MI6. Explain the root cause of your cynicism, because I think many of our listeners are similarly cynical.
Well, let's just take the case of Iran and the ghastliness of this regime and the fact that it's caused chaos internationally for more than 40 years. It's brutal, it's bloody, it's suppressed its own population. So I think there is a moral issue here. And you could argue that this conflict that's just started is the latest chapter in a war which, let's say, commenced on the 7th of October 23 when Hamas attacked Israel. So, if it's a chapter in an ongoing war, it isn't a violation of international law. And I mean, if you look at it historically, how many thousands of Americans have actually been killed by the Iranian regime? How does the Iranian regime identify itself? It's devoted to the destruction of Israel. It is devoted to opposition to what it calls the Great Satan. So I think you can make a legal argument that there's a legitimacy about this attack. On the other hand, if you take a strict UN-related view of the interpretation of international law, which is always being evolved by human rights lawyers, they will argue differently. Yeah. But I think there is such a thing in this instance as a moral stand against a ghastly, bloody regime. And okay, Trump is taking a huge risk here geopolitically, but I don't think any of us are going to mourn the disappearance of the Ayatollah.
Do you have any confidence, though, that the Americans have a plan here? Because it may be that they were just told, we've got this amazing situation, these 10 powerful guys, including the Ayatollah, are in one room madly, and we've got a shot at them. Do we take the shot? And the answer to that might just be opportunistically, yes. Is there a concern that there's the day 300,000-400,000 hasn't been thought through?
Well, I think it's impossible to think through because we don't know what's going to happen. But, there are two possibilities. One is you end up with an Iranian regime, which is still run by Ayatollahs, but is prepared to be more compliant and will negotiate with the Americans and with the rest of the Middle East. So that's one possibility. The other possibility is that, a revolution in Iran appears from nowhere, which once it's happened will look more or less inevitable, and you get a completely different sort of Iran. I think I would incline towards the first interpretation, with perhaps political change then happening in Iran over a much, much longer time frame.
What about option number 3, Richard, which is you end up with an Ayatollah who is more belligerent, more theocratic, more crazed with the sense of his own righteousness, and that's actually worse than we had before?
Well, then the war will continue because the Israelis will be intransigent as well. But bear in mind that Israel, the new Sparta, have effectively already defeated Iran militarily. And Iran is in a very weak position. So that scenario is a possibility, but Iran will not have the international reach to destabilize the whole of the Middle East. It will be sort of a beleaguered country on the back foot and very much threatened by the military power of Israel, which has proved so effective in dismantling the axis of resistance.
So you might not want to answer this question, but if you're in the incident room and you're giving advice to Donald Trump, in your view, at least from the outside, was this an opportunity too good to pass up?
Well, I'm not sure I would go that far. But, I mean, clearly what's happened, it wasn't an opportunity. Look, this has been planned for months by Israel and the United States. And the other factor in this, which hasn't been mentioned, the Americans have a very brilliant admiral commanding this operation, Brad Cooper. And I think there's much more care and logic behind it, perhaps, than people realize. I'm not saying that's a Trump logic. I'm saying it's probably a Brad Cooper logic. Let's see what happens.
And before you go, is Putin more vulnerable today than he was on Friday?
Yes, Putin is in a difficult position. He's losing his friends fast. American deterrence, whether we like Trump or not, is suddenly standing up on the world stage in a rather extraordinary way, which probably none of us had imagined would happen.
Interesting stuff. Richard, always good to speak to you. Thank you for joining us.
Great, Stig. All the best.
That's Sir Richard Dearlove, the former boss of the MI6.